The rain had been falling all day. Cold, steady, and without pause, it painted the small town in gray. Inside the public library near the edge of town, Margaret moved quietly between the shelves. Her cardigan sleeves pulled over her thin wrists, her steps nearly silent on the old carpet. She had worked here for 12 years and had grown used to the hush. In fact, she preferred it. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't remind her of Daniel. He would have been 19 this year, but Margaret never said his name aloud anymore. She simply kept filing, stamping, organizing one book, 1 hour, 1 day at a time. That evening, just before closing, the door creaked open. Margaret looked up from the returns desk to see a girl standing in the doorway, soaked from head to toe. Her hoodie clung to her, dark with rain, and her shoes squished with every step. She didn't say anything, just wandered between shelves. With that stiff, trying not to be seen walk that Margaret recognized immediately, she watched the girl for a long while. No umbrella, no backpack, no library card. When the girl reached out to touch a book, her fingers trembled. Margaret didn't ask anything. She simply reached beneath the counter, pulled out a small plastic bag of crackers and a juice box from the staff drawer, and set it on the edge of the desk without a word. She turned back to her work. The girl didn't take it at first. She kept drifting through the rows, pretending to read. But an hour later, when Margaret walked to the back corner of the children's section to turn out the lights, she found her curled up asleep in a faded beanbag chair, hidden behind old encyclopedias. For a long time, Margaret simply stood there. The girl's face was young but tired, her knees pulled up like she was still protecting herself even in sleep. Margaret knelt gently and whispered, "Is there someone you want me to call? Or do you just need somewhere dry for tonight?" The girl stirred, her eyes opened wide, startled. But something in the voice must have calmed her. She gave the tiniest nod. Margaret didn't ask anything else. She led her quietly to the staff break room, where an old couch sat beside a shelf of forgotten magazines. She laid out a blanket and handed her a towel. "You can stay tonight," she said softly. The girl didn't speak. She only sat there, dripping and watching Margaret like someone trying to decide if the moment was real. The next morning, the girl was gone. The couch was neatly folded, and the towel hung over the back of a chair. Margaret didn't expect to see her again. But 2 days later, the door creaked open during another storm, and there she was. Same hoodie, same silence. Margaret just nodded toward the snack bag on the counter. The girl nodded back and sat on the floor between two shelves. Hugging her knees, one afternoon, after a week of this quiet return, the girl said sharply, "I'm not some sad story, you know." Margaret, caught mid-shelving a book, paused. She didn't turn around. "Neither am I," she said, placing the book back in place. Silence stretched again, but it wasn't angry this time. That night, when Margaret closed up, she found a book left on the desk, The Little Prince. A note was tucked inside. It read, "You reminded me of the fox." It was weeks before anything deeper was said. One evening, the power flickered and snow fell quietly outside. The girl had wandered into the archive room, a space barely used anymore, where old newspapers hung in yellowing plastic sleeves. Margaret found her there, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, tears running silently down her face. She sat down beside her, not touching, just near. After a long time, Margaret whispered, "His name was Daniel. He would have been your age." One day he walked into the woods and didn't come back. Her voice didn't break. It was more like an exhale. "I used to sit at the edge of the forest every day, waiting for him to walk back out. But he never did." The girl didn't answer. She only leaned her head slightly toward Margaret's shoulder. They sat like that until the snow blanketed the window and the power finally went out. A few days later, the girl brought in a piece of paper, folded carefully. On it was a pencil drawing a boy and a fox beneath a tree. Margaret didn't say, "Thank you." She simply pinned it behind the desk, just above the staff picks shelf where Daniel's favorite book used to sit. That afternoon, she told a story about how Daniel once tried to reorganize the entire children's section and put the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe under F for a fur coat. The girl laughed, quietly, but it was real. From then On something shifted. Margaret started bringing 2 sandwiches instead of one. The girl, who eventually said her name was Leah, began helping shelve books. She never made a fuss. She never asked if she was allowed. She just helped. Margaret never stopped her. Their rhythm became habitual. A kind of quiet choreography, soup in thermoses, bookmarks made of scrap paper, evening tea in chipped mugs. Laughter in short bursts. One day, Leah began writing stories, tiny ones, folded up and hidden in the backs of books. Kids started finding them. Some came asking if there were more. Leah never claimed them, but Margaret always knew. She left little comments in the margins of the hidden pages. Eventually, Leah asked, "Do people donate books here?" Margaret nodded. "They do." Leah's eyes lit up. "Could I make a section?" Margaret smiled. "What would you call it?" They named it Runaway Tales, stories of foxes, forgotten towns, gentle ghosts, and girls who slept in libraries. A teacher from the nearby high school noticed. She helped Leah publish a small paperback collection. They called it Stories for a Rainy Day. It sold out at the local market. The library ordered 20 more. 15 years passed. One day, a ceremony was held at the now renovated library. A new wing had been added. The children's section expanded, bright with color and murals. A silver plaque was placed by the door. It read the Leah Fox Children's Wing. Inside, every book bore a small note on the inside cover, in honor of a story that needed shelter. Margaret, now with silver hair and slower steps, still sat behind the same desk. The old Foxen Boy drawing remained pinned behind her. One rainy afternoon, a little girl with wet hair walked in, wide-eyed and quiet. Margaret smiled and gently nodded toward the beanbag nook in the corner. She didn't need to ask a thing. The storm outside rumbled softly. But inside, the story continued. The seasons turned gently. Spring dripped into summer, and Leah began to spend more time at the library than anywhere else. Some days she would arrive before the doors opened, sitting cross-legged on the steps with a notebook in her lap, scribbling lines in careful, deliberate script. Margaret would unlock the door without a word, step aside, and the girl would slip in like she belonged there. No questions. No explanations. Their understanding didn't need them. Margaret started to keep small things around the library that only Leah noticed: cinnamon tea, a stack of blank journals she claimed were left over from an old writing group, even a little wooden fox figurine perched on the corner of the children's desk. Leah never asked where they came from. Margaret never offered. But every detail deepened the thread between them. They were both people used to being misunderstood in silence, and now they had found in each other a kind of shelter that didn't need to be named. Sometimes Leah would disappear for a day or two. Margaret never asked why. But when she returned, her hair messier, her eyes a little more tired, Margaret would simply gesture toward the tea kettle and say, "I saved your favorite cup," and Leah would breathe like someone who'd been underwater for just a little too long. The library's regulars began to notice. A few parents mentioned how the new section Runaway Tales was always checked out. Children whispered about the stories, hidden in the backs of books like treasure maps for lonely hearts. A young boy once tugged on Margaret's sleeve and asked if the girl who wrote about the fox was real. Margaret looked across the room, where Leah sat with a notebook tucked under her elbow and a pencil between her fingers. "She's real," Margaret said, "and she's writing even more." One afternoon, Margaret found a slip of paper on her desk. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It read, "When you found me, I didn't know I was worth being looked for." Margaret pressed it between the pages of The Little Prince and tucked the book onto the highest shelf, where the oldest stories lived. Years passed in quiet, beautiful rhythm. Leah grew taller. Her stories grew deeper. She stayed through high school, found part-time work at the library, and eventually applied to a small writing program in the city. Margaret helped her print out her application essays late one night, when the printer kept jamming. She didn't cry when Leah left, not even when the girl hugged her tight and whispered, "You saved my life." Margaret only nodded, brushing the girl's hair back gently like she had done so many nights without asking. Leah returned often. usually unannounced, sometimes just to sit at the table where she used to write. The town watched her become something more: an author, a speaker, a mentor to other young people who didn't quite fit into the world outside. But Margaret always saw her as the girl who came in out of the rain on the day the new children's wing opened. The town gathered in the library for the unveiling. There were cameras and cake and speeches. Leah stood beside the plaque, her fingers brushing the engraved letters of her name. "This isn't really about me," she said to the crowd, voice steady, soft. "It's about a librarian who gave me a blanket, a couch, and a place to write. I came here with no name worth remembering, and now my name lives in every story these walls hold. That's not magic, that's kindness." The applause rose like thunder, but Margaret stayed at the back, her hands folded, eyes shining. Leah met her gaze through the crowd. No words were spoken, but her smile said everything. "I remember that evening. Long after the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed, Margaret sat once again behind the old desk. She made her tea the same way she always had and opened a book at random. Inside was a folded note she hadn't seen before. Leah's handwriting. "You were the first page of my favorite chapter." Margaret closed the book and held it close, her breath catching in her throat. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and steady, the kind that asked nothing and promised only quiet. Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching the drops slide down the glass, and just before closing, the door creaked open. A small girl with wet hair, maybe 7 or 8, stood in the entrance, her coat too thin for the weather, her hands clenched at her sides. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled and nodded toward the reading nook. The girl stepped inside. The door closed. And the story, as it always had, began again. The years folded softly like pages turned, without fanfare. Leah's life moved outward, cities, book tours, interviews she stumbled through with trembling hands and eyes that still looked for home in every crowd. Yet no matter how far she went, the library always waited in the corners of her heart like a familiar scent or a remembered lullaby. Every book she published had a quiet dedication on the first page. For the woman who gave me back my name. Margaret never wrote about Leah, never spoke of her in more than gentle references. To the town, she was just Miss Margaret, the librarian, who knew every child's reading level by heart, who repaired cracked spines with invisible tape and left tissue-wrapped candies in the return box for children having bad days. But Leah knew the truth. Margaret was the quiet architecture beneath her becoming the reason her voice had a place to land. One day, nearly 2 decades after that first rainy evening, Leah returned to the town under a pale autumn sky. She hadn't planned it. She rarely did. Her taxi passed the old post office, the worn bakery, and finally stopped in front of the library. Still small, still familiar. The glass door bore a new decal now. Leah Fox Children's Wing in neat serif letters, but the bell above it still chimed the same soft tone as when she was 14. Inside, the light was low and golden. Afternoon sun spilled across the tiled floor in long stripes. Margaret sat behind the desk, slower now, a light blanket across her knees, but her eyes still as knowing as they'd always been. She looked up when Leah entered and smiled the kind of smile that required no ceremony. "You're late," she said quietly. Leah crossed the room and dropped her bag gently on the desk. "I stopped to get your tea. Still no sugar, right?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Still pretending I don't like it sweet, yes." They sat together in the reading nook, 2 cups steaming gently between them. No one else was in the library. Just the dust floating in golden light and the hum of the old heating vent. Leah pulled out a folded manuscript from her coat pocket and placed it in Margaret's lap. "I haven't shown it to anyone yet," she whispered. "It's about you." Margaret didn't open it. She only held it like something fragile. "Is it sad?" Leah shook her head. "No, just true." They talked until the light outside dimmed and the street lamps blinked on. Margaret's voice was softer now, sometimes trailing off mid-sentence, but her warmth never faded. "I'm retiring in the spring," she said. Leah didn't respond right away. She only looked at the corners of the room, at the small details that hadn't changed, the old checkout bell, the photo of the first book club, The fox figurine? Still perched near the monitor, when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Then I'll come home. Margaret blinked, not understanding. To take over, Leah added. The library. If the town will let me. Margaret stared at her for a long time. Then she reached out and gently touched Leah's hand. You already have. The weeks that followed moved like a soft snowfall. Margaret trained her without needing to say much. How to listen to what people don't ask. How to know when a book is just a book and when it's a life raft. Leah began cataloging the collection again, updating old systems, painting the children's wing in shades of soft green and light gold. She didn't change the reading nook or the beanbag. Some ghosts deserve to stay. Margaret's final day arrived quietly. There was no large party, only a small gathering of townsfolk, a tray of oatmeal cookies and a framed copy of Leah's first book on the counter. When Margaret stood to leave, Leah hugged her tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret shook her head. You made the stories. I just left the door unlocked. As she walked away, cane tapping gently, Leah stood in the doorway and watched her go until the figure vanished into the fading light. That night, after closing, Leah turned off the overheads and sat in the darkened library with a cup of tea and one lamp glowing beside her. She opened a blank journal and wrote the first line. Once, a girl walked into the rain and found a door that didn't ask for her name. She smiled. Outside, the wind picked up. Rain began to fall again, soft, steady, familiar. And just before midnight, the bell above the door chimed. Leah looked up. A boy stood there, maybe 10 years old, damp hoodie clinging to him, no umbrella, no backpack. He looked around with wide eyes. Leah rose slowly, walked to the counter, and reached behind it for a bag of crackers and a small towel. She placed them gently on the desk. You can sit over there if you like, she said, nodding toward the reading nook. It's warmer by the books. The boy hesitated. Then he nodded and stepped inside, and just like that the story turned. Another page. The boy came back the next evening. Leah had left the porch light on, just in case. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. But he took the same seat in the corner of the children's wing and curled up the same way Leah once had, knees to chest, eyes flicking over the shelves without really reading. She recognized the look. It wasn't hunger for books. It was looking for a place to exist where no one asked why. Leah brought him a blanket and a copy of Where the Wild Things Are. He didn't say thank you. But when she returned later, the book was open in his lap, and his shoes were neatly placed beside the chair. Days passed. Rain came and went. The boy returned in rhythm with it, always quiet, always alone. Leah began leaving small things near his corner: an extra pair of socks from a donation box, a granola bar, a pencil with a fox-shaped eraser. One evening he left a folded piece of paper on the counter. It had a drawing of the library. In the window he had sketched 2 figures, one tall, one small, both smiling, no words. Just lines pressed in pencil, soft and careful. The town began to notice Leah in new ways. They said she looked more like Margaret every day. She had the same way of remembering people's names, the same way of finding the perfect book without needing a computer. But she still left parts of herself tucked around the library like secret messages. Short stories slipped into jacket flaps, poems taped to bathroom mirrors, quiet affirmations written inside the covers of donated books. You belong here. Even now, especially now, one morning, an elderly woman came in holding stories for a rainy day. She stood by the front desk and waited until the line had cleared. Then she said, "My granddaughter found this at a thrift store." She read it 3 times and cried. I just wanted you to know it made her feel like someone understood her. Leah took the book in her hands, stared at the old cover, and blinked. Slowly, "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep writing." That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Leah walked through the empty library, turning off lights one by one. She passed the plaque on the wall, the Leah Fox Children's wing, and touched it lightly, like a memory. Then she walked to the reading nook where the boy now slept most nights, and tucked the blanket around him a little tighter. Outside, the street lamp flickered. A light wind rustled through the leaves. Leah stood by the window for a long time, watching the town she once ran from. She thought of Margaret, of her silence, of her steady hands, and her knowing smile. She imagined her somewhere warm, maybe by a fire, maybe still reading the manuscript Leah gave her all those years ago. Leah returned to her desk and opened her journal. She wrote only one sentence before closing it again. Some stories don't end. They just pass hands, and as the library sank into quiet, she looked toward the boy, now breathing evenly. One hand wrapped around a worn paperback, and felt something settle inside her. Not closure, not certainty, but something softer, a quiet knowing. A circle finally drawn, and outside the rain began again. The kind that sounds like memory. The boy's name, she learned quietly, was Jonah. He never said it himself. Not at first. She found it written in faded ink inside the collar of his hoodie one morning when he'd fallen asleep early and the sleeves had rolled back. Just Jonah, no last name, no address. She didn't mention it. She didn't need to. Names, she'd learned, find their way back when they're ready. He was older now, 14 or 15, quieter in voice but louder in presence, not with words but in his steadiness. He came every day after school, helped straighten the shelves, fed the library's stray tabby that wandered in at dusk. He began keeping track of overdue books with a seriousness that made Leah smile. You know, she told him once, you don't work here. Jonah had looked at her with that particular teenager mix of deadpan and hidden longing and replied, I know, but it feels like I do. She didn't argue. She just handed him a staff lanyard someone had left behind years ago. He wore it every day after that. He didn't ask about Margaret. But one afternoon, when Leah caught him tracing the outline of the fox figurine with his thumb, she told him about the first night she arrived soaked and voiceless, and how Margaret had simply pointed to the corner and said, You can stay. Jonah didn't speak after she finished. He just placed the fox back on the shelf and said, She sounds like someone who didn't need to say much. Leah nodded. She was. More time passed. Jonah began writing, not stories at first, but books he wanted to read, phrases he overheard, then fragments of poems he never finished. Leah would find his notebooks left open sometimes, on the front desk, and she'd leave a sentence in the margins. Not corrections, invitations, what happened next? Or, I know the silence. He never mentioned them aloud, but the next page would always continue the story. The library aged too, softly. The windows fogged quicker in winter, the floor creaked more in the west wing. Leah let it be. She believed in memory over renovation. Kids still came to find warmth in corners and stories between covers. Elderly men came to read newspapers they already knew the contents of. Mothers came to sit in silence beside strollers. Teenagers came to charge their phones and stare at ceilings, and pretend they weren't afraid of growing up. And through it all, Leah remained. Quieter now, slower, her hair streaked with silver. Her presence something felt before it was seen. One cold January morning, Jonah arrived before opening hours. He stood at the glass door with a manila envelope clutched in one hand. Leah let him in without asking. He sat at the same desk he always did, and after a long silence he said, It's a letter of acceptance. Leah blinked. College? He nodded. Creative writing. He tapped the envelope. I put one of the Fox stories in it. One of yours, from back then? She didn't speak, just smiled, slow and full. That fox, he added, has followed. Both of us, hasn't it? She chuckled quietly. It tends to stay close to people who need reminding. When he left that night, he hesitated at the door. The same pause she remembered herself making once. Not because of uncertainty, but because of how hard it is to leave the first place that held you without question. Will it be okay without me? He asked. Leah looked around the library, the shelves he had straightened, the notes he had left, the laughter he had drawn into the air without trying. It already is, she said. Because you were here. Years later, after Jonah had gone on to publish his first small volume, Foxes and Other Places to Hide, he returned unannounced on a quiet spring day. He walked through the familiar aisles, touched the wood of the checkout desk, and found the fox figurine still perched in the same place. Leah wasn't there. The lights were low. A small note was taped to the front door, "Closed today." Gone walking, Jonah waited on the steps for hours. Around dusk, Leah appeared, slower now, wrapped in a scarf, her hand tucked into her coat pocket like she was holding something invisible. She saw him and smiled. "Did you remember where the tea is?" He laughed. "It hasn't moved in 15 years. They sat together long after dark, no lights on, just silhouettes framed in streetlight and the occasional hum of a passing car. Jonah pulled a folded letter from his pocket and handed it to her. She didn't open it. "Just tell me," she said. "It's an offer," he replied, "to take over after you." "If you're ever ready." Leah didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her hand reached for his and rested there, warm and still. "You already have," she whispered. And beside them, the fox figurine watched, as always, quiet, unmoving, eternal dot outside. The wind carried a warm rain across the rooftops, and somewhere another child with no name yet worth remembering took shelter in a doorway, waiting for a story to begin. Of course. Let's follow the story to its quiet, hopeful closing years later, when the library has become more than a place, when Jonah's presence has settled into the very walls, and when the story prepares to pass into the hands of someone who, like all the others before, simply notices the silence and stays long enough to listen. Jonah never made announcements, never said the word retire, and never wore a watch. Time moved differently in the library, like breath slow, unnoticed, always there. His beard had silvered, his walk slowed, and his eyes carried that soft, worn shine of someone who had read too many endings and still believed in beginnings. The townspeople had grown used to him being there. They called him Mr. Jonah now, and he'd nod without correcting them. A teenager once asked if he'd been born in the library. Jonah only smiled and said, "Something like that." The girl with the two big shoes? Her name was Elsie. She grew into them and into her voice, which came slowly and carefully. Jonah never asked what she'd been through. He didn't need to. She showed him in the books. She chose quiet ones about foxes and forests and kids who didn't speak for whole chapters. When she was old enough, she started shelving books, then cataloging them, then writing notes of her own and slipping them into covers. "You're safe now. This page waited for you." "Me too," Jonah watched without interfering, the same way Leah had once watched him. He recognized the gestures, the way Elsie checked the corners before turning off the lights, the way she learned names without asking, the way she kept tea warm even when no one else was around. She didn't fill space, she kept it open. Like Jonah, like Leah, like Margaret. One afternoon, a boy about 11 came in with red eyes and no backpack. Elsie found him staring at a copy of Charlotte's Web, fists clenched. She sat beside him and said nothing for a while. Then, gently, "You don't have to read it. You can just hold it." The boy looked at her like that was the kindest thing anyone had ever said. Jonah watched from the front desk, hands folded, and knew without knowing that something had just been passed forward again. That night, after everyone had gone and the lamps glowed low, Jonah brought out the small tin box from beneath the counter. The one Margaret had left for Leah, the one Leah had left for him. Inside were handwritten notes, guides, poems, coffee-stained quotes, and one yellowed slip of paper that said, "The right person always notices." He added one more, "It's not about fixing. It's about staying." Then he locked the box and left it. On Elsie's desk, weeks later, the town held a small ceremony. Not because Jonah asked, but because someone found out it had been exactly 30 years since the night a runaway boy had walked in soaked and alone. Jonah didn't give a speech. He just said thank you, then pointed at the shelves and said, "The stories did most of the work." Everyone laughed, and a few cried, and afterward they stayed to drink cocoa and listen to Elsie read a poem she'd written for him. It was about silence and how sometimes it's the truest kind of listening. The next morning, Jonah handed her the ring of keys. No big moment, no speech. Just a soft smile and a single sentence. "You'll know what to do." He didn't come back the next day, or the one after, but the lights were on early, and the tea was warm, and in the corner of the children's wing, a small boy with wide eyes held a book he couldn't yet read, while a girl not much older than him leaned close and whispered the first sentence softly into his ear. The story, as always, went on, and somewhere else in a quiet room filled with morning light Jonah sat by a window with a book in his lap. Eyes closed, lips curved, maybe reading, maybe remembering, maybe just listening to the sound of pages turning somewhere far away. Would you like the full story compiled into a single narrative flow?